Celia Hart, a bright-eyed 19-year-old from Brooklyn, New York, was known for her creativity and passion for writing. As a young girl, she had always dreamed of becoming a published author, and those dreams only grew stronger as she entered adulthood. Celia had a unique way with words, often spending hours at the local cafes, writing short stories and capturing the essence of the world around her. She had a close-knit group of friends who admired her for her talent, her caring nature, and her infectious laugh. She was the type of person who brightened any room she walked into, and for those who knew her, it was hard to imagine a world without her in it. On the evening of June 7, 2008, Celia had plans to meet up with her friends after finishing her shift at the local bookstore. The cafe where she often worked was bustling that evening, and she had mentioned that she was looking forward to the weekend. Celia had made a habit of sharing every little detail of her day with her friends, and there was no reason to believe anything was amiss. However, that evening, as the hours ticked by and Celia didn't show up for their meeting, her friends started to get concerned. At first, they thought maybe she had simply lost track of time, maybe she had gone out with someone else or had something come up last minute. But by the time midnight arrived, they began to realize something wasn't right. By the next morning, Francesca Hart, Celia's mother, couldn't shake the feeling of dread gnawing at her. It wasn't like Celia to miss a meeting with her friends, especially without any prior notice. Her phone went straight to voicemail when Francesca called, and that's when the panic set in. She called Jacob Hart, Celia's father, who was working out of state at the time. He rushed back to New York immediately, and together they filed a missing persons report. It was a mother's worst nightmare, and for Francesca, this nightmare had only just begun. Detective Rachel Monroe was assigned to the case, and she immediately began the difficult task of retracing Celia's steps. The investigation started with the basics: interviews with Celia's friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen her on the night she disappeared. Celia's friend, Sophie Matthews, told the detective that they had planned to meet at the usual cafe, but Celia never showed. Sophie explained that Celia had seemed excited about the weekend plans and hadn't mentioned anything unusual leading up to that day. Sophie also mentioned that she and Celia had talked earlier in the day about writing, and Celia had sounded like her usual self, optimistic and full of ideas. There was nothing in their conversation that indicated Celia was in any distress. As Detective Monroe dug deeper, she spoke to Tom Reed, Celia's boss at the bookstore, who also reported that there were no signs of anything out of the ordinary at work that day. Celia had stayed late to help organize inventory and left just like she always did. There was no indication that she had been meeting anyone after work, nor did she mention anything to Tom about being upset or having problems at home. Monroe learned that Celia had been active on social media earlier in the evening, posting updates and pictures from the cafe where she worked, and she had mentioned plans to meet her friends afterward. The fact that there were no signs of foul play or any clues that could lead to Celia's whereabouts was unsettling. Despite this, the first few days of the investigation were filled with hope. Celia's parents and friends held on to the belief that she would be found safe. They plastered the town with missing person posters, used social media to spread the word, and reached out to local news outlets for help. For those who knew Celia, it was impossible to imagine that she had simply disappeared without a trace. But as the days passed without any new information, the reality began to set in. The police were unable to find any security footage of Celia leaving the bookstore or heading to meet her friends. No one could recall seeing her that night after work. Her phone records were checked, but nothing out of the ordinary stood out, just a few outgoing texts to friends and family. Detective Monroe remained hopeful, but as each hour passed, the likelihood that Celia had simply run away seemed less likely. As the second day passed with no word from Celia, Francesca and Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of dread. They began calling hospitals, checking with local shelters, and contacting anyone who might have seen something, but it was as if Celia had vanished into thin air. Her friends were interviewed, and everyone who knew Celia described her as a loving daughter, a devoted friend, and someone who would never simply disappear. There were no signs that Celia had been involved in any kind of conflict or had any enemies. She had no history of running away, no reason to leave without a trace. Detective Monroe's frustration grew as there were no leads, no suspects, and nothing to explain why a young woman with such a promising future could vanish without a trace. The first few weeks passed in a blur of frantic searching and unanswered questions. The Reed family's grief grew with each passing day. Francesca couldn't sleep. She spent sleepless nights combing through Celia's belongings, searching for any clue that might explain where she had gone. Jacob became more withdrawn, unable to cope with the helplessness that had settled over their family. They had spent the first few days trying to remain positive, but as the investigation stagnated, doubt began to creep in. Was Celia still alive? Or had something worse happened to her? Sophie Matthews and the rest of Celia's friends began to turn to each other for support, but even they couldn't stop the panic from seeping into their hearts. Detective Monroe, despite her years of experience, struggled with the lack of leads. The lack of physical evidence in the case was baffling. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who could recall seeing anything unusual, and no leads that could explain Celia's sudden disappearance. Monroe continued to run through every possible scenario, every avenue, but nothing seemed to add up. She requested additional resources from the NYPD and reached out to cold case units, hoping that someone with a fresh perspective might be able to spot something that had been overlooked. By the end of 2008, the case had gone cold. It was moved to a pile of unsolved cases that would sit in a drawer for years, awaiting the slightest breakthrough that could bring some sense of closure. For the Reed family, this was the hardest part. Not knowing what happened to their daughter was unbearable. They continued to hold out hope, but that hope started to feel like a weight they could no longer carry. For Francesca, the idea that her daughter could be out there, lost and alone, was a pain that never left her. Jacob, too, struggled with the idea of not knowing whether Celia was alive or dead. They kept her room exactly as it had been, hoping that someday she would walk back through the door. But with each passing day, they felt further away from the truth. The disappearance of Celia Hart had stunned the small Brooklyn neighborhood, and as the days turned into weeks, Detective Rachel Monroe and the rest of the police team were left searching for answers. Celia's case was different from most missing persons cases in the sense that she wasn't a runaway. She was a bright, promising young woman who had no history of erratic behavior. She was well-liked, responsible, and had always been close to her family. The idea that she could simply vanish without a trace seemed impossible. Yet, in the weeks following her disappearance, it became clear that the circumstances surrounding Celia's case weren't just unusual, they were becoming baffling. As the lead investigator on the case, Detective Monroe threw herself into the investigation with the same determination she brought to all her work. She had seen many difficult cases in her years on the force, but this one felt personal. There was something about Celia's disappearance that gnawed at her, something that didn't fit the typical pattern of missing persons cases. Most cases could be explained in some way, even if the resolution wasn't always easy. But Celia's case defied explanation. It wasn't like she had simply wandered off or run away. There were no signs of foul play, no struggle at the scene, and no leads to follow. It was as if Celia had simply vanished into thin air. Monroe's first step was to review Celia's daily routine. She met with Celia's family, trying to piece together her movements on the evening of June 7, 2008. Francesca and Jacob Hart spoke about their daughter in glowing terms, describing her as an independent and motivated young woman. Francesca, in particular, couldn't understand why Celia had suddenly stopped communicating. She explained how her daughter was always in touch, whether by text, phone, or social media. Celia never went a day without letting us know how she was doing, Francesca told Monroe, her voice breaking. For her to just vanish, it doesn't make sense. Monroe took note of this, knowing that this fact would be crucial in the investigation. Celia had no history of mental illness, no signs of self-destructive behavior, and she was close to her family. Yet, despite this, she had seemingly disappeared into thin air. The case was a riddle, and Monroe had to break it apart piece by piece. The first step was to track Celia's movements on the day she went missing. Celia had worked a shift at the bookstore in the afternoon, and by all accounts, it had been an ordinary day. She had no signs of distress, no conflicts with her co-workers, and had left the bookstore on time around 6:30 p.m. According to her colleagues, Celia had seemed excited about her plans to meet her friends, and there was nothing unusual about her demeanor. Monroe spoke with Tom Reed, Celia's boss, who confirmed that Celia had left the store as planned. He had no reason to believe anything was wrong. Monroe then turned her attention to Celia's phone records. While there was no physical evidence of Celia's whereabouts, her phone might provide some clues. Celia had sent several texts that day, including a message to her friend Sophie Matthews, confirming their plans to meet up. That was the last known communication from Celia. After that, her phone went silent, with no further activity until the following morning when her parents reported her missing. Monroe requested that the phone company provide records of Celia's activity, hoping that it might help them trace her movements. The initial review of Celia's phone records didn't provide any immediate answers. There was no sign of suspicious activity, no strange calls or texts from unknown numbers. The last message Celia had sent was a simple, "See you soon, can't wait to catch up." Monroe also looked through the social media activity linked to Celia's account, but there was nothing that stood out. The posts from earlier in the day were typical, filled with casual updates about her plans and her excitement for the weekend. She was a young woman enjoying life, not someone who seemed to be in any kind of trouble. Despite these seemingly benign interactions, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the case. Celia's phone records weren't enough to crack the mystery, and her friends and family didn't have any additional information. In the following days, Monroe expanded her investigation, speaking to local businesses in the area where Celia had been last seen. She learned that Celia had been spotted at the cafe she frequented, but no one had noticed anything unusual. The waitstaff recalled that Celia had been in good spirits, and nothing about her demeanor suggested that she was in danger or being followed. By the end of the first week, there were still no new leads. Detective Monroe started to feel the weight of the case bearing down on her. She had worked missing persons cases before, but this one was different. Celia's family was devastated, and the pressure to find answers was mounting. The case was rapidly growing cold, and the longer they went without any new information, the harder it became to keep hope alive. Monroe then turned to surveillance footage from nearby businesses, hoping to find something that might have been missed. After days of combing through hours of footage, she found something that seemed insignificant at first but quickly turned into a key piece of the puzzle. A grainy video from a corner store near the bookstore showed a young woman matching Celia's description walking down the street toward the park around 9 p.m. The woman appeared to be walking alone, and there was nothing in her movements that suggested she was in distress. She walked with a purpose, but nothing in her body language suggested she was being followed. Monroe couldn't be sure it was Celia, but the time frame matched, and the woman appeared to be heading in the direction of where Celia was supposed to meet her friends. The video provided the first glimmer of hope. If Celia had been walking alone, it was possible that she had gotten lost or encountered someone along the way. But there were still so many unknowns. Where had she gone after the park? Why didn't she show up to meet her friends? What had happened between 9 p.m. and the next morning when she was reported missing? Monroe expanded her search to include people who might have been in the park that evening. She spoke to local residents, dog walkers, and anyone who had been out at that time. But no one seemed to have seen anything unusual. The park, though frequently visited, was quiet that night. It seemed as though Celia had vanished into thin air, with no one noticing her disappearance until it was too late. By the end of the second week, Detective Monroe began to face the uncomfortable truth. They were no closer to finding Celia than they had been when she first went missing. The case had gone cold, and all they had were fragments of evidence that didn't seem to add up. But even as she faced this difficult reality, Monroe refused to give up. She knew that there had to be something they were missing. If Celia was still alive, they needed to find her. And if she wasn't, they needed to find out what had happened, and why. The case would sit in limbo for months. Monroe's frustration grew as the investigation stalled, but she knew that in cases like these, persistence was key. The mystery of Celia Hart's disappearance was far from over. She was determined to bring the case back to life, even if it meant revisiting every lead, every piece of evidence, and every theory she had considered. But the road ahead would be long, and the answers would be hard to come by. As the weeks passed without any solid leads, Detective Rachel Monroe continued to exhaust every avenue of investigation into Celia Hart's disappearance. The quiet streets of Brooklyn had always been a peaceful backdrop for the bustling city, but now, there was an undercurrent of unease that seemed to permeate everything. For Celia's family, each day without news was another day spent in limbo, where hope and dread coexisted. They had trusted the police to find answers, but with each passing day the question began to form in their minds: could anyone truly find Celia? In the early stages of the investigation, Monroe had approached the case with the expectation that the answers would be simple, that the missing young woman might be lost, or had gotten involved with someone, perhaps someone close to her. But as the investigation dragged on, a troubling realization started to take shape. There were no clear signs of Celia leaving on her own. There was no indication that she had run away or decided to start a new life. She had no enemies, no tumultuous relationships, and no history of strange behavior. But as Detective Monroe pored over the facts again, the unsettling truth became clearer. The case wasn't as simple as it seemed. Monroe's team began to turn their focus to potential suspects. There was, after all, the possibility that Celia had been taken, or that someone close to her was involved in her disappearance. And in small communities, it was not unusual for the perpetrator to be someone familiar, someone in the periphery of the victim's life. It wasn't uncommon for murder or abductions to occur at the hands of someone who had a close relationship with the victim, someone who had access to their life, their habits, and their weaknesses. The first suspect on Monroe's radar was Celia's ex-boyfriend, Marty Cartwright. Marty had been in a short but intense relationship with Celia during the previous year. Friends of Celia described the relationship as volatile. Marty was known to have a temper, and despite their attempts to keep things civil after the breakup, there was still tension between them. However, Celia had made it clear that she didn't want anything to do with him anymore. She had even told friends that she felt relieved when the relationship ended, and she had seemed happier in the months following their breakup. But Marty's proximity to Celia made him a person of interest. Detective Monroe reached out to him for questioning, but his alibi for the night Celia went missing was solid. He had been out of town with friends and no one had seen him near Celia's apartment that night. Although his behavior had raised some flags, there was no concrete evidence to tie him to the case. Still, Monroe made a mental note of Marty's past behavior, noting that his potential involvement could not be ruled out just yet. Next, Monroe focused on Celia's coworkers at the bookstore where she worked. Celia had been employed there for nearly 2 years, and while no one at the store had any major concerns about her safety, Monroe thought it was worth revisiting her interactions with her colleagues. She interviewed Jared Matthews, a coworker who had known Celia for a while. Jared was a quiet, reserved young man who had always been polite, but nothing stood out about him. Still, his proximity to Celia at the bookstore made him a potential lead. He had been one of the last people to see her the evening she disappeared. According to Jared, Celia had been in high spirits, looking forward to her plans with friends. He couldn't recall any odd interactions between them. Yet, after some careful questioning, Monroe learned that Jared had been acting oddly when the police had first arrived to investigate. His hands trembled slightly when questioned, and he seemed unnervingly distant about the situation, almost as if he wasn't fully invested in helping find Celia. His unease had been noted by several colleagues who observed him in the days following her disappearance, and that discomfort was enough to warrant a deeper look into his background. After running a criminal check, it became clear that Jared had a history of petty theft and had been fired from multiple jobs in the past. But there was nothing more significant in his criminal record that could link him to Celia's disappearance. Still, Jared remained a person of interest. His alibi was weak. He claimed to have been at home alone when Celia disappeared, but no one could confirm his whereabouts. Monroe found his reluctance to speak openly about the case unsettling, especially given that he was one of the last people who had seen Celia. Could he have been hiding something? The police decided to keep a close watch on him, but without further evidence, there wasn't enough to arrest him. The investigation into Jared Matthews remained inconclusive. Then there was Elliot Carter, a friend of Celia's who had recently reconnected with her after not being in touch for several months. Elliot had been in the same social circle as Celia throughout high school but had disappeared from her life after graduation. It wasn't until a few weeks before her disappearance that they began talking again, and Celia had even mentioned that they had planned to meet up to catch up on old times. Elliot was known to have a troubled past, with rumors circulating about his involvement in drugs and other illicit activities. Still, he was someone Celia had trusted, and she had made it clear that she wanted to reconnect with him. Elliot had a motive, but it was unclear what that might have been. The idea that Celia could have been harmed by a former friend was deeply unsettling to those who had known her, especially since Celia had seemed excited about rekindling their friendship. Monroe reached out to Elliot Carter, but he was uncooperative from the start. He seemed defensive and reluctant to speak, offering only vague answers to questions. His alibi for the night Celia went missing was weak, and he claimed to have been out of town visiting family. However, there was no way to verify his story. Monroe began to suspect that Elliot might have known more than he was letting on. With each passing day, the list of suspects continued to grow. From Marty Cartwright to Jared Matthews to Elliot Carter, everyone seemed to have a piece of the puzzle, but no one seemed to hold the key. Detective Monroe had the difficult task of sifting through potential leads, trying to make sense of the confusion. What connected these men to Celia's disappearance? What was the link between them all? Were they all just coincidentally involved in her life at the time of her disappearance, or was one of them directly responsible for what happened to her? For Monroe, the investigation had become a battle of wits. She needed to dig deeper into each of these suspects, uncovering their pasts, their relationships with Celia, and their possible motives. But the more she learned, the less clear the case seemed. Celia's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case, it was becoming something far darker, something deeper. Detective Monroe knew that the answers were out there, but it would take everything she had to uncover them. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now, not after everything Celia's family had endured. As the investigation stretched into its second month without any significant progress, Detective Rachel Monroe began to feel the heavy burden of the case weighing on her. The pressure from Celia's family, the media, and the community was mounting, and the longer the investigation went on without any new leads, the more hopeless it seemed. The evidence was scarce, the suspects uncooperative, and every lead felt like it had been exhausted. Monroe had done everything she could think of, from following up on alibis to interviewing potential witnesses, but still the mystery of Celia Hart's disappearance remained unsolved. It was becoming increasingly clear that the case was slipping into the dreaded category of a cold case. While Detective Monroe was not one to give up easily, the odds were stacked against her. Despite her experience and determination, the lack of tangible evidence left her grasping at straws. The town of Brooklyn had once been known for its quiet, bustling streets and sense of safety, but now, it felt like an eerie silence had descended upon it. The residents, once hopeful that Celia would be found, began to lose faith. Francesca and Jacob Hart, Celia's parents, had spent every waking moment since their daughter's disappearance fighting for answers. They had put up flyers, organized search parties, and spoken to anyone who might have known something, but as the weeks turned into months, the feeling of hopelessness grew. Francesca, in particular, had become consumed by the idea that Celia might still be out there somewhere, but she also feared that the truth would be something far darker than she could bear to imagine. Each phone call, each knock on the door brought with it the possibility of good news, but it never came. The hope that Celia might be found alive was slowly fading. Jacob, though a man of few words, felt the weight of the situation too. He watched as his wife became increasingly distraught, and he found himself fighting his own feelings of helplessness. He had always been the protector, the one who kept everything together, but now it seemed like there was nothing he could do. The town that had once been a place of safety and security now felt like a stranger's land, empty, quiet, and filled with the shadows of unanswered questions. Jacob's frustration was palpable, but his desire to remain strong for Francesca meant that he never showed his true feelings. Instead, he buried them deep, as if doing so would somehow keep him from falling apart. As the months passed, the investigation slowed. Detective Monroe had a small team, but they too were running out of ideas. The case seemed to have hit a dead end. The suspects, Marty Cartwright, Jared Matthews, and Elliot Carter, had all been questioned extensively, but none of them had provided anything substantial. Each man denied involvement in Celia's disappearance, and there was no physical evidence to contradict their claims. Monroe had even consulted with other experts in cold cases, hoping that a fresh set of eyes would reveal something new, but no one could find the missing piece of the puzzle. Marty Cartwright, though he had been a person of interest, had an alibi that was impossible to dispute. He had been with friends out of town when Celia went missing, and no one could prove otherwise. There were no signs that Marty had made any contact with Celia after their breakup, and his ex-girlfriend had insisted that she had no lingering feelings toward him. Even though there were people in the community who thought he might have had a motive, nothing concrete could be tied to him. The police didn't have enough to charge him, and his alibi stood up under scrutiny. Similarly, Jared Matthews, the bookstore co-worker who had acted strangely during his initial questioning, had also been cleared. Monroe had hoped that he might be hiding something, but his history was clean, and there were no witnesses who could place him at the scene. While his behavior had been odd, there was no indication that he had any personal motive to harm Celia. The strange vibe around him had faded into suspicion, but there was nothing solid that could implicate him. Elliot Carter, the old friend who had re-entered Celia's life just weeks before her disappearance, remained a difficult figure for Monroe to understand. He had been one of the last people to speak to Celia before she vanished, and there were still unanswered questions about his relationship with her. Elliot had expressed a desire to rekindle their friendship, but there was something unsettling about his behavior. He had grown defensive when questioned, and there were rumors that he had been involved in less than legal activities. But once again, his alibi was unshakable, and no one could find any proof that he had been in the area the night Celia disappeared. Elliot's name lingered in Monroe's mind as a possible suspect, but like the others, there was no hard evidence to suggest his involvement. The lack of evidence in the case was beginning to eat away at Monroe. She knew how important it was to keep the case open, to keep searching for answers, but with each passing day, it became harder to maintain the hope that Celia would ever be found. Detective Monroe had seen enough cold cases to know that they could sometimes be solved years down the line with new information, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She had promised Celia's family that she would do everything in her power to find their daughter, but as the case grew colder, that promise became harder and harder to keep. The community of Brooklyn, too, began to feel the impact of Celia's disappearance. While the residents had rallied together in the early days of the investigation, the growing sense of helplessness began to settle over them. The police station, once busy with leads and updates, now felt quieter. There were fewer people showing up to the community meetings and fewer volunteers coming forward to help search for Celia. The tragedy of her disappearance had left an indelible mark on the town, but as time wore on, the memory of the girl who had once been full of promise seemed to fade into the background. Francesca continued to visit the police station every week, hoping for any new information. She had learned to live with the uncertainty, but it was taking a toll on her. Every day was a reminder that her daughter was still missing, still out there somewhere, and that no one knew where she had gone. Jacob, though supportive, had become withdrawn. He had stopped going out as much, spending more time alone trying to make sense of everything. The sense of loss was too great for him to fully process. In the stillness of their home, he often found himself staring at Celia's photos, unable to shake the feeling that something was being left undone. It wasn't until the end of 2010 that Detective Monroe received an unexpected breakthrough. While going through the records once more, she stumbled upon an overlooked detail, a missing persons report filed in a nearby county that had gone uninvestigated. It was a long shot, but something about it caught Monroe's eye. She knew this could be the turning point they needed. The investigation was far from over, and Monroe was more determined than ever to find out what happened to Celia Hart. It had been over 2 years since Celia Hart vanished without a trace, and Detective Rachel Monroe had grown accustomed to the daily weight of the case. The files, the witness statements, the lack of tangible evidence, it all blurred into a fog of frustration. She had done everything she could think of, but the case had become a lifeless shell. No more fresh leads, no more possible suspects, just the haunting memory of a young woman who had disappeared, and the quiet plea of a mother who was too desperate to give up. But then, in late 2010 came the breakthrough. It wasn't something dramatic, no grand confession or sudden revelation, but something small, something that had been overlooked before. A missing persons report from a neighboring town, Brooklyn Heights, had been filed months after Celia's disappearance. It wasn't related to her directly, but the circumstances surrounding the case felt oddly familiar. The description in the report matched the kind of pattern that Detective Monroe had seen with Celia. The moment she read the report, a spark of recognition flared. It was the kind of lead that could change everything. The report involved a young woman named Lily Thompson, a 20-year-old from Brooklyn Heights, who had gone missing under eerily similar circumstances. She had disappeared one evening, leaving behind no signs of a struggle, no clues about where she had gone. Her phone was turned off, and her family hadn't heard from her. Lily's disappearance had been largely ignored by the media, as there were no major leads, no connections to a possible suspect, and no suspicious circumstances, just a disappearance that seemed as impossible to explain as Celia's. What caught Monroe's attention was not just the disappearance of Lily Thompson, but the fact that the last known place she had been was a small cafe in Brooklyn, a cafe Celia had frequented, the very cafe where she had worked. Lily's last known text message had also been sent to a friend, mentioning plans to meet someone. That detail was eerily similar to what Celia had written in her final texts. Both girls had been seen walking alone at night. Both had been in the same area just days before their disappearances. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Monroe knew that these could be connected. There was something more here, something deeper than just two separate disappearances. The two cases had been filed separately and no one had ever connected them, but now Detective Monroe felt a gut instinct that told her this was the lead she had been waiting for. She contacted Lily Thompson's family to request further details and discovered that, much like Celia, Lily had no reason to disappear. She had no enemies, no relationship issues, and no financial problems that would suggest she would leave willingly. In her pursuit of this new lead, Monroe reached out to the investigators who had worked on Lily Thompson's case. She requested a copy of the files, hoping to find any clues that might tie Lily's disappearance to Celia's. The more Monroe read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The similarities between the two cases were too great to ignore. Both women were in their early 20s, both had been last seen walking alone in Brooklyn, and both had planned to meet people but had never shown up. There was a clear pattern emerging. Someone was targeting young women in Brooklyn, and the evidence was suggesting a deeper connection between these disappearances. Monroe now had a new, singular focus. The possibility of a serial abductor, or worse, a serial killer, was not something she had anticipated, but the more she connected the dots, the more it seemed like the only plausible explanation. There had to be a link between Celia and Lily's disappearances. But the question was, who was behind it? The focus shifted to a pattern of behavior that pointed to someone stalking, manipulating, and ultimately taking the victims. This wasn't random, it was calculated, and someone was orchestrating it. But who? The next step was to look into any individuals who might have crossed paths with both women, any possible connections between them. Monroe reached out to Lily Thompson's friends, asking if they knew anyone who had been acting suspiciously in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. That's when she received a tip that seemed too small to be important, but it was exactly the type of lead that could turn everything around. A woman, a local who frequented the same cafes as Celia and Lily, mentioned an acquaintance who had been seen talking to both girls in the days before they went missing. The person's name was Elliot Harper. Elliot Harper was an enigmatic figure in the neighborhood. He was a quiet, introverted man in his late 20s who worked as a part-time delivery driver. Though he didn't have a criminal record, several people mentioned his awkward, almost uncomfortable mannerisms when speaking to women. There was something about him that made people uneasy. He didn't have any direct connections to either Celia or Lily, but he was a fixture in the neighborhood, often seen at the same coffee shops and parks. His name had never been mentioned in any previous interviews with Celia's or Lily's families, but it stood out now, especially considering the proximity of his sightings to the time of their disappearances. Monroe immediately pulled Harper's background, running a full check on his history and activities in the neighborhood. She learned that he had grown up in Brooklyn Heights, just a few blocks away from where both girls had been seen. He had attended a local high school but had never gone to college. He had a small group of acquaintances, but no one seemed to know much about him. In fact, it seemed like most people who spoke about him found it difficult to say much, as if they didn't have a strong connection to him. As Monroe dug deeper into Harper's life, she uncovered some unsettling details. In high school, he had been the subject of several rumors, mostly related to his odd behavior and strained relationships with peers. He had never been violent, but there were accounts of him becoming overly possessive and jealous in romantic relationships. It seemed like he had a pattern of fixating on women, particularly those who were vulnerable or easily approachable. Monroe had found the key piece of the puzzle, but she still needed more evidence to connect him to the disappearances. The breakthrough came when Monroe uncovered surveillance footage from a camera outside a local grocery store that had captured Harper's movements. The footage, dated just days before Celia's disappearance, showed Harper in the vicinity of the cafe where Celia had worked. The video showed him walking toward the cafe and glancing over his shoulder before entering the building. His presence at the scene, so close to where Celia had been the night she disappeared, was the confirmation Monroe needed. Harper's behavior was now too suspicious to ignore. Monroe brought in Elliot Harper for questioning, and when he was confronted with the evidence, he cracked. Though he initially denied any involvement, his story began to unravel as Monroe pressed him on details. Harper's obsession with both Celia and Lily Thompson became apparent. He had been watching them for months, and his fixation on them had only grown stronger in the weeks leading up to their disappearances. In a chilling confession, Harper admitted to stalking both girls. He had followed Celia from the bookstore the night she disappeared, and had lured her to a secluded area with the promise of meeting someone he knew. When she refused to cooperate, he panicked and abducted her. His remorse was non-existent. Instead, he spoke about how he had felt entitled to their attention, believing that they owed him something. It was a twisted sense of control that drove his actions, and it was a relief for Monroe to finally have the truth. With the confession in hand, the case that had once seemed hopeless began to take a new shape. Celia Hart and Lily Thompson had been targeted by someone who had watched them for months, someone who saw them not as people but as objects to be controlled. The horror of what had happened was finally laid bare, and justice for Celia, and the community, was within reach. The arrest of Elliot Harper was a pivotal moment in the case, a moment that would forever alter the course of the investigation into Celia Hart's disappearance. For Detective Rachel Monroe, the events leading to the arrest were a mixture of triumph and disbelief. For months, the case had been stagnant, and the lack of progress had left a sense of helplessness in the air. The victims, their families, and the entire community of Brooklyn had been living in a state of uncertainty. But now, with the evidence against Harper mounting, the investigation was finally on the verge of breaking wide open. The night Elliot Harper was taken into custody, the tension in the air was palpable. Monroe knew that this was the moment they had been working for, but even as they drove to his apartment to make the arrest, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what was about to unfold. The truth was finally coming to light, but in doing so, it would unearth the dark and twisted nature of Harper's obsession with the two young women, Celia and Lily Thompson, whose lives had been forever changed by his actions. The team arrived at Harper's apartment building, a nondescript complex in a quieter part of Brooklyn Heights. The building was eerily silent, a stark contrast to the chaos of the investigation. Monroe, along with her team, approached the door with caution, knowing that Harper had been under surveillance for some time and could be unpredictable. They had to be prepared for anything. Harper had no idea the police were on his tail. He was sitting in his apartment, quietly watching TV, when the officers knocked on his door. For a brief moment, Monroe saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he looked through the peephole. It was then that Harper knew something was about to change, but instead of fleeing or resisting, he opened the door without hesitation. There was no denial, no attempt to run. Instead, he allowed them to take him into custody as if he had been waiting for this moment. As Harper was handcuffed and led out of the apartment, the only emotion he displayed was a cold, detached look on his face. There were no tears, no visible remorse for his actions. It was as if he was completely indifferent to the lives he had destroyed. Monroe, though relieved that the investigation had reached a significant milestone, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that came with seeing Harper's demeanor. There was something unsettling about how calmly he accepted his fate. For Monroe, it was clear that Harper had never viewed Celia or Lily as human beings, but as mere objects to control. At the police station, the interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing above as Monroe prepared for what she hoped would be a breakthrough in the case. Harper was seated across from her, his eyes fixed on the table. The tension in the room was thick, but Monroe wasn't going to give him an easy out. She had all the evidence, all the details, everything that pointed to him as the person responsible for the disappearances of Celia Hart and Lily Thompson. This time, she wasn't going to allow him to slip through her fingers like he had before. Monroe began by reciting the facts. She laid out the timeline of Celia's last known moments, the footage of him seen near the cafe, and the phone records that connected him to both women. She didn't give him the chance to speak at first. Instead, she made it clear that there was nowhere left for him to hide. "You've been following these women for months, Eli," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We know you've been stalking them. We know you were at the cafe the night Celia went missing. And we know that you were the last person to see her alive. Why don't you tell me what happened that night?" Harper didn't respond immediately. He sat in silence, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. There was no visible sign of fear or concern on his face, just an unsettling calmness. It was as if he was waiting for something, almost as if he was preparing himself for what was to come. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Harper finally spoke, his voice cold and detached. "She wouldn't listen to me. She didn't understand. I just wanted her to see that we were meant to be together." Monroe's stomach churned as she listened to his words. Celia had been so full of life, and now, here was this man, offering an excuse for what he had done. It was as if Celia's refusal to be with him was a justification for his actions. Monroe had heard this kind of mentality before, the twisted justification of an abuser, but hearing it from Harper made it all the more chilling. "She didn't deserve what happened to her," Harper continued, his eyes glazed over. "But she was never going to see it my way. I had no choice." Monroe leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "You had a choice, Eli. You always had a choice. And instead of respecting her boundaries, you decided to take matters into your own hands. You took her away from her family, from her friends, and from everyone who loved her. And you did the same thing with Lily." Harper's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch at the accusation. There was no visible remorse, no recognition of the horror he had caused. He simply stared at Monroe as if she were the one who had caused the damage, not him. "I didn't hurt her," he muttered under his breath. "I just wanted her to understand. She wasn't listening. She was rejecting me. And she never gave me a chance." It was clear now that Harper's obsession had grown to unhealthy extremes. He had been watching Celia Hart for months, following her every move, trying to force her into a relationship she didn't want. When that failed, he resorted to violence. His confession was chilling not because of its explicit nature, but because of how matter-of-fact it was. There was no guilt, no remorse. There was only a justification for his actions, a justification that didn't seem to make any sense to anyone who wasn't trapped in his delusion. Harper continued to speak, recounting the details of how he had approached Celia that night. He described how he had lured her into a secluded area, hoping to force a conversation. When she refused to engage with him and attempted to leave, he said he snapped. That's when he admitted to attacking her, overpowering her, and leaving her lifeless. He claimed that he hadn't meant to kill her, but in his twisted mind, it made sense at the time. He had felt entitled to her affection, and when she rejected him one last time, he took her life as a form of retribution. After hearing Harper's confession, Detective Monroe knew that the case was finally coming to a close. She had the confession, the motive, and the evidence that tied him to both Celia Hart and Lily Thompson. Harper's arrogance had allowed him to think he could get away with his crimes, but now, with the truth exposed, he was finally going to be held accountable. For Celia's family, it was a moment of both relief and sorrow. The arrest of Elliot Harper didn't bring back their daughter, but it brought them one step closer to understanding the dark truth behind her disappearance. And though the pain would never fully go away, at least they knew they would have justice. The man responsible for Celia Hart's death, Elliot Eli Harper, was not a stranger to the people of Brooklyn. He had grown up in the neighborhood, a quiet, nondescript figure who blended in with the crowd. He was never particularly popular, but he wasn't a social outcast either. He had acquaintances, people who would occasionally greet him in passing, but he never seemed to form lasting friendships. His early years were largely unremarkable, and nothing in his background raised alarms to anyone who might have known him at the time. But as Detective Rachel Monroe dug deeper into Eli's past, she began to uncover a history of troubling behavior, a pattern that, in hindsight, seemed to have led him down a dark path. Elliot Harper was born to a modest family in Brooklyn Heights, not far from where he would later meet Celia Hart and other young women. His parents, Vince and Claire Harper, were both hardworking individuals, but their relationship was often strained. From an early age, Elliot had witnessed his parents' volatile relationship, filled with arguments and periods of emotional neglect. His father, though never violent, was emotionally distant, and his mother struggled with her own issues, including bouts of depression. This lack of stability in the home left a deep mark on Elliot, shaping his worldview in subtle yet damaging ways. By the time Elliot entered Brooklyn High School, he had already begun to show signs of isolation. He was quiet, introspective, and often kept to himself. He didn't participate much in social events, preferring to stay in the background rather than seek attention. His peers noticed his aloofness but didn't think much of it. He wasn't the type to stand out, and he certainly wasn't the type to be involved in anything serious. However, Elliot's obsession with control began to manifest in small, unsettling ways. He had a few short relationships during high school, but they were marked by possessiveness and jealousy. Those who knew him said that he would often become upset when his girlfriends showed interest in other people, and he frequently accused them of being disloyal, even if there was no evidence to suggest that. His ex-girlfriends described him as overly clingy and insecure, always needing to be the center of attention. When the relationships ended, Elliot seemed unable to accept the loss. He would try to stay in contact, sometimes even stalking them on social media, constantly checking on their lives. His inability to move on after these breakups left a deep impression on those who had dated him, and many of them eventually distanced themselves from him. After high school, Elliot struggled to find a clear direction in life. He bounced between low-paying jobs and occasional odd gigs, never staying in one place for too long. He lacked ambition and was often content with minimal effort, getting by on the bare minimum. His social life remained stagnant, and he had few friends who truly cared about him. The isolation he had felt as a child grew worse as he got older, and the only way Elliot knew how to cope with his feelings of inadequacy and loneliness was through unhealthy means, primarily through his obsession with certain women. It wasn't until 2007, nearly a year before Celia's disappearance, that Elliot's behavior began to take a more disturbing turn. That was when he first saw Celia Hart. She was everything that Elliot was not: social, confident, and full of life. He watched her from a distance, initially intrigued by her beauty and charisma. But as he observed her, something in him began to stir. He saw in Celia not just a potential partner but an object. Someone he could control, someone who could fill the void he had carried with him for so long. His obsession with her grew quickly, though he never approached her at first. He followed her on social media, looked up her background, and even memorized the places she frequented. His desire to get closer to her became an all-consuming fixation. Elliot's first attempt at contacting Celia came in the form of a casual encounter. He found out through a mutual acquaintance that Celia worked at a local bookstore, so he began visiting the store more frequently, pretending to browse while secretly watching her. He started leaving notes on her desk, complimenting her on her writing and encouraging her to keep pursuing her dreams. The notes were vague and friendly at first, but as time went on, they became more personal, even possessive. He would leave long, rambling messages about how he could help her with her writing, how they could both build something together. In these notes, he revealed a side of himself that was not just obsessed with Celia's success but also with the idea that he was entitled to be part of her world. The more Celia ignored him, the more determined he became. It wasn't long before Elliot began to show up at the cafe where Celia worked. At first, he was just a face in the crowd, someone who came in every so often, ordered a coffee, and sat at a table by himself. But his presence became more frequent, and it didn't take long before Celia noticed him. She would greet him politely, but her discomfort was apparent. She had a way of distancing herself from him, avoiding eye contact or moving to the back of the cafe when he was around. To anyone else, his behavior would have seemed harmless, a lonely man with a harmless crush. But to Celia, it felt like something more sinister, something that made her skin crawl. She had confided in her friends about how Elliot Harper made her feel uneasy, but none of them took it seriously at first. They brushed it off as an overreaction, never suspecting that it would escalate the way it did. As the months went by, Elliot's behavior grew more erratic. He began sending Celia text messages, even though she never responded. His messages became more direct, demanding that she meet him. He would tell her how special they could be together, how they were meant to connect, and how he couldn't live without her. His messages seemed like the ramblings of a man who had crossed the line between infatuation and obsession, but Celia remained distant, refusing to acknowledge him. She had told her friends that she would block him if it continued, but still the messages kept coming. Each time she ignored him, Elliot's frustration grew. By the time 2008 rolled around, Elliot's obsession had taken on a dark edge. He was no longer just a lonely man harboring a crush. He had become a man consumed by the idea that Celia belonged to him. The more she rejected him, the more desperate he became. He began following her in public, showing up at places he knew she frequented. He watched her from across the street, followed her through the park, and even showed up uninvited at the bookstore during her shifts. His fixation on her was all-consuming. But the night that Celia disappeared was the tipping point. Elliot had convinced himself that if he could just talk to her, convince her to understand him, everything would be fine. He didn't want to hurt her, not really, he just wanted to make her see how much they were meant to be together. It was this twisted belief that led him to make the fateful decision to follow her that night, to confront her in the quiet, empty streets of Brooklyn. And that night, Celia's rejection would cost her her life. The trial of Elliot Eli Harper began on a cold and overcast morning, drawing a crowd of onlookers eager to witness the justice they had been waiting for. The town of Brooklyn had been waiting for this moment for months, and now the man responsible for the deaths of Celia Hart and Lily Thompson would finally be held accountable. Detective Rachel Monroe sat in the front row, her eyes focused on the man who had once seemed like an ordinary citizen. Now, with his dark past revealed, he was the face of the town's darkest nightmare. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Claire Harper, began the trial with a statement that sent chills through the courtroom. The case against Harper was clear, backed by overwhelming evidence. His obsession with both victims, the surveillance footage, and his confession. Celia's family, particularly Francesca Hart, had been waiting for this moment for so long. She sat quietly, her eyes heavy with sorrow, but her resolve was unwavering. The man who had taken her daughter's life was about to face justice. The defense, on the other hand, sought to paint a different picture of Harper. His attorney, Victor Reed, argued that Harper's actions had been driven by mental illness, by the deep-rooted emotional scars of his troubled upbringing. The defense focused on the idea that Harper wasn't in control of his actions, that his obsession with the two women was a product of his psychological breakdown. This attempt to lessen the charge from murder to manslaughter was met with skepticism, especially as the prosecution laid out the timeline of the crime in detail. As the trial unfolded, the emotional testimonies of Celia's and Lily's families were gut-wrenching. Sophie Matthews, Celia's best friend, took the stand first. She spoke of her fear and the overwhelming sense of loss after Celia disappeared. Sophie's voice broke as she described the nights she and the others spent searching for their friend, only to find out that the person they had trusted was the one who had taken her. But it was Francesca Hart who delivered the most emotional testimony. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of grief. She spoke of the daughter she had raised, the young woman full of potential, who had been stolen from her in the blink of an eye. As she looked at Harper in the courtroom, she found it difficult to understand how a man could be so consumed by obsession that he could take someone else's life. It was a question that would haunt her forever. The trial dragged on for weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments. The defense's strategy to argue diminished capacity was met with strong rebuttals from the prosecution, who argued that Harper's actions were premeditated. He had stalked Celia and Lily for months, and his obsession had grown to the point where he felt entitled to control their lives. The idea that his actions were the result of mental illness didn't fit with the calculated way in which he had executed the abductions. The turning point came when Detective Monroe took the stand. Her calm demeanor and methodical recounting of the investigation made the case against Harper even clearer. She spoke of the many hours spent reviewing evidence, following leads, and ultimately, discovering the pattern in Celia and Lily's disappearances. When asked how she had felt when the breakthrough came, Monroe replied simply, "I was relieved, but I was also saddened. It's hard to find justice when the person responsible has no remorse." The trial ended with the closing arguments, and the jury was sent to deliberate. The entire courtroom held its breath as the jury returned hours later. The verdict was clear. Elliot Harper was found guilty of first-degree murder for both Celia Hart and Lily Thompson. The town of Brooklyn had its justice, but the families of the victims were left with the bittersweet realization that no sentence would ever bring their loved ones back. After days of intense testimony, the trial of Elliot Eli Harper was finally nearing its conclusion. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, and the sense of unease was palpable. The families of Celia Hart and Lily Thompson, who had endured so much over the past few years, sat silently, their hearts racing as they awaited the jury's verdict. The wait felt like an eternity for them. Francesca Hart, Celia's mother, had spent countless sleepless nights hoping for this day to come. The realization that they might finally receive the justice they so desperately needed was overwhelming, yet it didn't erase the sorrow of losing their daughters. The jury had deliberated for several hours, and the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The courtroom, usually filled with the sounds of murmurs and rustling papers, had fallen into an eerie silence. The fate of Elliot Harper was now in the hands of 12 jurors, who would decide whether he would be held accountable for his actions or if there was room for leniency based on his psychological state. Detective Rachel Monroe, who had worked tirelessly on the case from the beginning, stood off to the side, waiting for the decision. Despite the overwhelming evidence, she couldn't help but feel a sense of uncertainty. Harper's defense, which had argued for diminished capacity, had attempted to create a murky picture of the defendant. Would the jury buy into the idea that Harper's obsession with Celia and Lily was the result of a psychological breakdown, or would they see through the facade of remorse he had put up on the stand? Francesca held Jacob's hand tightly as they watched the jury file in. Her eyes were red from days of emotional exhaustion, but she remained steadfast, hoping that the end of this painful chapter would at least bring some form of closure. Jacob, though composed on the outside, was a man deeply affected by the events. His body had grown tired, and his mind weary from the years of searching for answers. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly at peace. But today he clung to the hope that the truth would prevail. The foreman of the jury, Linda Hayes, stood up, holding a piece of paper in her hands. The courtroom, which had been holding its breath, went completely silent. All eyes were on her as she spoke, her voice calm and deliberate. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Elliot Harper, guilty of first-degree murder for the deaths of both Celia Hart and Lily Thompson," she announced, her voice echoing through the room. The words landed like a hammer. The tension that had built up for months, the long hours of anticipation, suddenly gave way to a flood of emotion. Francesca Hart let out a gasp, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't speak, but her body trembled as Jacob pulled her close. The pain that had been festering in their hearts, the grief of losing their daughter, was now tempered with the recognition that the man responsible had been held accountable. The emotional release was palpable, but it was also bittersweet. For Francesca and Jacob, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it didn't bring their daughter back. It didn't undo the years of heartache, the endless hours spent wondering if she was out there somewhere, alive or dead. The jury's decision couldn't fill the void Celia's absence had created. Outside the courthouse, reporters flooded the streets, eager to get a statement from anyone involved in the case. Detective Monroe stood with her colleagues, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The case had been a long, difficult road, but the truth had finally come to light. Harper, despite his defense, was held accountable for the brutal, premeditated killings of Celia Hart and Lily Thompson. The town of Brooklyn, though scarred by the events, could begin to heal. In the days that followed, the community came together to mourn the losses of the two young women, but also to celebrate the justice that had been served. Celia's and Lily's families, though still deeply wounded, found comfort in knowing that the person responsible for their pain would face the consequences of his actions. For Elliot Harper, however, there was no relief. The cold, calculating man who had taken the lives of two young women was now facing a life behind bars. He would be remembered not as the quiet neighbor he had once been, but as the man who, driven by his own twisted desires, had caused a ripple of pain that would affect countless lives for years to come. The conviction of Elliot Harper brought a mixture of relief and sorrow to the town of Brooklyn, New York. For Celia Hart's family, it was the moment they had been waiting for, a moment when justice was finally served. But even though the verdict had been handed down and Harper was sentenced to life in prison, the emotional scars left by his crimes would never fully heal. Celia and Lily Thompson had been two vibrant young women with so much potential, and no amount of justice could undo the damage caused by Harper's actions. For the people of Brooklyn, the verdict marked the end of a long, drawn-out ordeal, but it didn't erase the pain that had been felt in the community. Celia's disappearance had shattered the sense of safety that had once defined the town. Brooklyn had always been a place where people knew each other, where the streets felt familiar, and where neighbors looked out for one another. But now, after the case, that sense of security had been forever altered. There was a palpable shift in the community, a new, cautious awareness of the potential dangers that could be lurking in the shadows. The local news outlets, which had covered the case extensively, now turned their attention to the aftermath. News anchors and reporters flocked to the courthouse to gather reactions from the residents of Brooklyn. On the streets, the people who had been directly affected by the case, the friends, families, and neighbors of Celia and Lily, were grappling with a mixture of emotions. Some were relieved, their faces marked by quiet tears, while others expressed a sense of numbness. There was no joy in the justice that had been served. It felt more like an obligation fulfilled, the final chapter in a long, painful story. Francesca Hart, though grateful for the conviction, found herself struggling with the reality of her loss. She had spent years fighting for answers, tirelessly working with the police, the media, and the community to keep Celia's story alive. But now that the case was closed, she felt the deep, aching emptiness of her daughter's absence more than ever. She spoke to reporters with a heavy heart, thanking everyone who had supported the search for Celia, but it was clear that the victory didn't bring the peace she had hoped for. "I'm thankful for the justice," Francesca said in an interview shortly after the trial, her voice trembling. "But no amount of justice will bring her back. It doesn't fix the hole that's left in my heart." Jacob Hart, who had always been the strong, silent type, found his grief expressed in more subtle ways. He had always been the one to take care of the details, the one who kept things moving forward, but the trial had taken a heavy toll on him as well. In the weeks following the verdict, he became more reclusive, spending long hours alone in his workshop, working on projects that had once given him a sense of purpose. The quiet space provided him with a place to think, to try to make sense of the years of pain and loss. Despite their emotional struggle, the Hart family remained strong, and in some ways the support of the community helped them navigate the aftermath. The town rallied around them, offering condolences and assistance, but the lingering sadness in the air was palpable. The grief was collective, shared by the entire town, but especially by those closest to the victims. The case had brought Brooklyn to the forefront of media attention, and while that had been difficult for the residents, it also sparked important conversations about safety, justice, and the way communities deal with the aftermath of such horrific crimes. Local organizations began organizing forums to discuss ways to better protect young women, to prevent future tragedies like this from occurring. The town's leaders and community members came together to create stronger support systems for victims of violence and abuse. Yet, even as the town began to move forward, it was clear that Celia Hart and Lily Thompson would never be forgotten. The case had left an indelible mark on everyone who had been involved, from the family and friends to the investigators and community leaders. The faces of the victims were now etched into the minds of the people who had known them, and the ripple effects of their loss would continue to shape the future of the town for years to come. As the years passed following the conviction of Elliot Eli Harper, the case of Celia Hart and Lily Thompson continued to reverberate through the town of Brooklyn. The emotions that had surged during the trial slowly gave way to a quieter, more complex grief. While Celia's family found some semblance of closure in the guilty verdict, the loss of their daughter was not something that could ever be truly healed. The legacy of Celia Hart's case was one of both justice and sorrow, justice that did not erase the ache of absence, and sorrow that lingered long after the courtroom doors had closed. For Francesca and Jacob Hart, the trial had brought the closure they had longed for, but it hadn't undone the years of uncertainty or the pain of losing their daughter. Francesca, in particular, struggled with a new kind of emptiness. In the weeks following the trial, she found herself often sitting in Celia's room, the room that had once been full of her daughter's laughter and dreams. It was now a quiet shrine to what had been lost. Her daughter's belongings, her books, her clothes, and her handwritten stories, remained untouched, as if by leaving them exactly as they were, Francesca could preserve some small piece of Celia. But as time passed, she realized that nothing could bring back the young woman she had raised. The town of Brooklyn itself had also begun to rebuild, but the effects of the case were still felt in the community. The murder had shattered a sense of security that had once been taken for granted. People were more cautious now, more aware of the dangers lurking in their own neighborhoods. The bond of trust that had existed between neighbors was fractured, and though people still greeted one another on the streets, there was an undercurrent of fear that hadn't been there before. Celia's and Lily's tragic deaths had changed the way the community viewed safety. However, the case also led to positive changes. In the aftermath of the trial, local organizations began pushing for stronger measures to protect young women from predatory behavior. Celia's and Lily's families, along with community leaders, worked together to establish support groups for victims of violence and advocacy for stronger safety policies. There were town meetings, workshops, and awareness campaigns that brought attention to the importance of recognizing the signs of obsession and harassment before they escalated to violence. These initiatives aim to prevent future tragedies and educate the public about how to support those who might be silently suffering in unhealthy relationships or situations. For Detective Monroe, the case of Celia Hart and Lily Thompson remained a difficult chapter in her career. While the conviction of Elliot Harper had been a professional achievement, it had come at a high personal cost. The emotional toll of investigating such a heartbreaking case never fully left her. She had seen the aftermath of violence countless times in her career, but the cold, calculated way in which Harper had stalked and manipulated his victims had left a lasting impression. Monroe continued to work on cold cases, but the legacy of Celia's case remained with her. It had driven home the harsh reality that evil often lies in plain sight, in the most ordinary of places, hiding in people who seem like everyone else. In the years that followed the trial, Celia's story remained etched in the hearts and minds of those who had known her. Memorials were held in her honor, and her writing, her greatest passion, was shared with the community. She had been more than just a victim of a crime. She had been a young woman with dreams, aspirations, and a bright future that was stolen far too soon. Her legacy was not just in the justice that was served but in the way her life had touched those around her. Through the support of her family, her friends, and the community that came together in the wake of her disappearance, Celia's memory lived on. In Brooklyn, Celia's death would always be remembered, not as a tragedy that defined the town, but as a tragedy that ultimately led to change. Her case had served as a catalyst for awareness, for change in local law enforcement practices, and for a renewed sense of vigilance within the community. And though the ache of loss would never fully fade, the town of Brooklyn had found a way to honor her memory by ensuring that the lessons learned from her case would shape the future for generations to come. For Francesca and Jacob, the years ahead were filled with an ongoing process of healing. The conviction of Elliot Harper had been an important milestone, but the journey toward emotional recovery was long and uncertain. They had lost their daughter, and nothing could fill the void she had left. But they had each other, and they had their memories of Celia, the girl who loved to write, the girl who had dreamed of so much, the girl who had been taken too soon. Though Celia's story had ended tragically, her legacy had only just begun.